Hi everyone, this is week 3 of LCD 120. This is the first of several videos I'm going to post to Blackboard, so please make sure you watch all the videos for this week. This week we are going to continue learning about lexical categories, but first I'll just review a little bit of what we've covered so far to set the stage for our discussion of lexical categories. So recall that English is a widely spoken language spoken by millions of people around the world, and as such, because of that, it has many different dialects and varieties that vary based on region, class, ethnicity, gender, etc. In this class, we focus on just one special variety of English, which we call Standard English. Remember that we're not saying that this Standard English is better, more correct. It's just standard. We're also not even saying that it's more or less formal. In fact, Standard English can be formal or informal. We're just saying that it's a standardized form of the language that everyone has access to and it's used in public life. So linguists don't describe languages as more or less correct, as better or worse, but we use a different set of distinctions. We describe varieties as standard or non-standard, as formal or informal, and especially as grammatical or ungrammatical. So in here we'll be talking about the structure of Standard English, and we'll be trying to describe the structure of grammatical sentences in Standard English. And to do that, we'll sometimes point out what types of things are ungrammatical. These aren't things that are wrong or incorrect or informal, they're just ungrammatical. So Standard English can be defined like any variety based on its morphology, its phonology, types of words it uses, but also its sentence structure. So that's what this class focuses on, is the structure of sentences in Standard English. So sentence structure is complex, and it can lead to ambiguity if multiple syntactic structures are possible for a given string of words. So for instance, the sentence, I saw the elephant with the binoculars. This sentence has two possible meanings. Either the elephant was holding binoculars, or I used binoculars to see the elephant, which was far away from me, presumably. So why does it have those two possible meanings? Well, in fact, the syntactic structure for those two interpretations is different. This depends on where in the syntactic hierarchy this phrase with the binoculars exists, where it's positioned. And where that phrase is positioned in the structure of the sentence is directly related to our interpretation of it. So in one case, that phrase modifies the verb saw, and in another case it modifies the noun elephant. And we'll eventually come up with some ways to depict that structural difference. So you're probably familiar with some categories already, these labels like noun, verb, adjective, adverb, preposition, tense, subject, object, predicate. These are probably terms that you're familiar with, and we're going to define these categories in this class. We're going to define them syntactically. So just to give a little bit of structure first, categories like noun, verb, adjective, adverb, and preposition, we're going to call these lexical and grammatical categories. We're going to use the term categories. Probably you are familiar with the term parts of speech for these types of categories. Some other categories, like subject, object, predicate, those we're actually going to call functions. And then things like imperative, interrogative, passive, these are actually sentence types. We won't talk about this too much in this class, but these are separate from the notion of categories and functions and look more at the effect of a sentence. So today we're just going to focus on categories, specifically lexical and grammatical categories. And these are the basic building blocks, the sort of atoms of any sentence in English. Lexical and grammatical categories have certain properties that distinguish them. So lexical categories typically are open classes. So this means that they have very many members, thousands, tens of thousands, and you can add new members to the category. Lexical categories are also frequently borrowed. So that means you can use a word from another language in your language. For instance, the English word tsunami. That's not a native English word, it was borrowed from Japanese and adapted to the phonology of English. We very rarely borrow grammatical categories. Lexical categories can also head phrases. So that will make a bit more sense in a few weeks when we talk about phrases. But basically what that means is a noun is going to be the most important part of a noun phrase. We'll also talk about prepositional phrases. So the head of a prepositional phrase is a preposition. Lexical categories also usually have synonyms and antonyms. So for instance, the adjective happy has synonyms like glad and joyful. It also has antonyms like sad or depressed. Grammatical categories like the don't have these types of relationships with other words, so there's no opposite of the. So on the other hand, grammatical categories are just the opposite of lexical categories. So grammatical categories are closed class items. That means there is a limited set. So for instance, if we think about the grammatical category of auxiliary verb, we'll be able to come up with a list of all the auxiliary verbs in English. Can, will, should. It's a small set of verbs. Grammatical categories are also rarely borrowed. They do not head phrases, and they don't have synonyms or antonyms. So if we look at a nonsensical piece of English, like the language in the poem Jabberwocky, we can see that the grammatical categories actually remain, while the nonsense words are all lexical categories. So this speaks again to the distinction between lexical and grammatical categories. We can easily add new words to a language by adding more lexical items, but the grammatical categories can't be changed. Words that behave as grammatical categories cannot be modified. So here we see words like brillig, slithy, toves. These all mean nothing, but we know that they are verbs, adjectives, nouns, or whatever. All of the grammatical categories look just like they would in any other English sentence. So and, the, did, and, in, were. These are all grammatical English words, grammatical categories. So the lexical categories that we're going to describe here are noun, verb, adjective, adverb, and preposition. That's the total list for us. Grammatical categories that we're going to have here are determiner, auxiliary, coordinator, and complementizer. So this is one approach to lexical and grammatical categories in English. If you read in other books, you might come across some slight differences. So for instance, some accounts of English grammar use the term conjunction. So how are conjunctions categorized in this framework we're using here? Conjunctions will be covered by the categories coordinator, so words like and, or words that coordinate to like phrases, and complementizers. So complementizers introduce a complement phrase or an embedded phrase in a sentence. We'll come back to this next week. So there may be other categories that seem missing here. Please let me know if you have questions about other possible categories that you think we haven't covered. There are terminological differences depending on the approach to English grammar. So we can discuss any other categories you have questions about. Just a reminder, all categories, lexical or grammatical, are going to be defined by their morphology, so that's the shape of the words in that category, and their syntax, or their distribution. We also call these diagnostic tests. So in terms of morphology, lexical categories usually allow some types of suffixes or prefixes, and grammatical categories usually don't. So in grammatical categories, usually the form of the word doesn't change.